Good morning and welcome to our community affairs program that we call 30 Minutes. Today we bring you part one of a two-part program featuring Deputy Secretary of Agriculture Stephen Vaden of Union City. Deputy Secretary Vaden recently spoke at the WAVE Ag Conference held in Hickman, highlighting issues facing American farmers today. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Growing up on his family's diversified farm in northwest Tennessee, just right across the border, and over on the southwest Kentucky side, I believe your first family farm was here in Fulton County, right? He has a passion for agriculture, and it was instilled in him at an early age. That passion has guided his very impressive career, which spans agriculture, law, and public service. Judge Stephen Vaden was appointed as the Deputy Secretary of the United States Department of Agriculture on July 7, 2025. Alongside Secretary Brooke Rollins, Deputy Secretary Vaden leads the department's operations and implements policies that support America's food and farm systems. A native of Union City, where he roamed the halls of Union City High School, to now roaming the halls in the capital city, Deputy Secretary Vaden has served as a judge on the U.S. Court of International Trade, where he had a lifetime appointment that he left to come back to USDA, and as general counsel of the USDA, where I first met him back under the first administration when he was responsible for writing all the rules and regulations of the hemp industry. He spent a whole week touring Kentucky. Throughout his time as general counsel, he led successful Supreme Court litigation, advanced regulatory reform, and supported the implementation of the 2018 Farm Bill. He's a graduate of Vanderbilt and Yale Law School, a public servant with strong agricultural roots. He's committed to revitalizing rural America and ensuring an abundant, affordable, and safe U.S. food. No matter the role, his Tennessee agricultural roots have helped guide him, and no doubt will help to continue as he guides USDA. I want to give a quote that really rings a lot to me that come from him. The main thing I want to do is bring common sense. I think we can all nod to that, right? Amen. What it's all about is people are trying to grow products Americans need to survive, and the farmers that grow it need to make a fair profit in order to be able to continue to do so. Join me in welcoming Deputy Secretary Stephen Vaden.
Well, thank you all so much. It's wonderful to be here with you this afternoon. It's wonderful to have an excuse to be back home in my official capacity. I want to talk with you this afternoon about a couple things. First, I want to talk to you about the unfair advantage I have over my cabinet counterparts when it comes to discussing issues of rural America, the importance of place that I know you all know so well. I also want to take a moment to talk about the state we find our agricultural economy in, what I think some of the reasons why we are seeing these lower commodity prices, the systemic reasons, and what I think we need to do to begin to pull ourselves out of that situation. And then finally, I want to say a little bit about our Farmer Bridge Assistance Program, which I was absolutely thrilled to sit down and see your placemat, where you have the exact numbers of dollars that are coming to the river counties. I took a picture of that and sent that to the Secretary so that she could see the impact it's having and how important these dollars are, because it's important for us to know when we're sitting in Washington, D.C. and we're talking about these very large sums of money, the evidence of how important these dollars are to the communities that we're here to support. So first, we live in a society, I don't have to tell you, that is increasingly urban in focus, and where it is something of a status symbol for one to hopscotch around the country on aircraft and be at any place at any time. That is not the status of rural America. People who live in rural America know very much the importance of having roots in a particular area and for those roots to go back in generations. I remember growing up in this area in the 80s and 90s. and what wonderful communities there are here in West Kentucky and Northwest Tennessee. And if you were to look at the official statistics kept by the Census Bureau of both our economic statistics as well as our population statistics, you would discover that for many counties in rural America, this area included, it was roughly the 70s through the mid-90s that many of these counties hit their peak population and also hit their peak economic development. And unfortunately, what we have seen over the past 25 years, particularly after the 2001 economic crash, is a stagnation or even slow decline throughout much of our rural communities. Now, it's almost expected that the families that we raise in this area will need to go elsewhere to have the advantage of a good paying job and be able to start families themselves. This is unfair, this is not right, and our economic system cannot be such where 90+% of our land is taken up by rural America, and yet it's an area of economic stagnation. That is not the sign of a healthy country. It's not the sign of a healthy economy. That's why I am so grateful to be part of an administration where the focus from the President to the Department of Agriculture to each of our cabinet colleagues is on rural prosperity. When I talk with the Secretary of Commerce, when I talk with the Secretary of the Treasury, when I talk with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer, for all of those gentlemen, the Secretary of Treasury accepted. He was actually, as he frequently likes to discuss, formerly a soybean farmer. He owned thousands of acres in North Dakota, but because of ethics rules, had to sell out his interest there in order to be Treasury Secretary. They have learned about the importance of rural America and its economy. And that's why when this administration is engaging in trade negotiations, you can take my word for it. The first thing every country gets told when they sit down to have a trade negotiation with the United States is the same thing. If you're not going to open your market to American farmers and what they produce, there's no use in our having a conversation. We're not going to open our markets to your goods if you're not going to open your markets to American farmers' goods. That's why each and every trade agreement and trade framework that you have seen, including with some surprising countries, to be perfectly honest, have included an ag piece. Over the past 7 months, I have met with the Prime Minister of Australia, the President of Uzbekistan, the ambassadors from Germany, Canada, New Zealand, and countless other nations. And each of them are coming to meet with us to talk about how much and in what quantities of agricultural commodities they can buy from the United States, because they're not going to have a successful relationship with this administration if they're not doing something to help our farmers. And that message has been loud and clear. When I am seated at the White House and we are having discussions about matters that affect national policy, I mentioned earlier that I have something of an unfair advantage. Nearly all of the colleagues with whom I work every day come from the many large cities that dot our country. Most of those large cities happen to also not be full of the president's voters. I come from counties that voted for the president 80-20. When I come home on the weekends, which I do frequently, the conversations that I hear at Walmart, at the gas station, at church, if it's on your mind, if the message is landing, if it's not going to be any different than any other county in this country that voted for the president. And it means something when I can say that you think something. He really does care what you think. He cares because he knows you put him there. And he doesn't let anybody forget it. And he says it far more bluntly and with a lot more profanity than I would use. But he gets that point across. And I have a recent example. I hope you'll excuse me. I can't talk about what topic we were discussing, as this matter has not been publicly revealed yet. But we were having a discussion at the White House just before Christmas last year on an important topic to rural America. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but sometimes not all of the president's cabinet agencies initially agree on what the solution should be. And so when that happens, they call us together and we have a discussion. And we talk about our different points of view and why we have these different points of view. So I was sitting there in the West Wing having a rather effervescent discussion with my colleagues about what position the administration should take on a different issue, on a particular issue. And I will admit, I was one of the more effervescent parts of that conversation. But there came a time when, as things happen and you're having a good conversation, people are talking over one another. And the man who convened the meeting, and I shall leave his name out of it, raised his hand. And he called for there to be quiet. And he pointed at me and he said, "It is important for me to hear what the highest ranking farmer in the United States government thinks about this issue." He told everyone else to be quiet. And he wanted to hear one last time how it would affect the American farmer. And I talked about how the issue we were discussing affected the farms in Fulton County, Kentucky, or Vaden County, Tennessee, that I have. I'm certainly not the world's largest farmer by any means. But if it's affecting my family, it's affecting all farmers. After I said my piece, the leader of the meeting, who again shall remain nameless, said, "Do what he said." It carried the day. Practical experience matters, even in Washington, D.C. So I have a very unfair advantage over my colleagues when I can point to a specific instance and say, this is what it meant for me. This is what it meant for my farming operation. This is what the people of West Tennessee and West Kentucky are going to see about this. And when you get further west and you get even bigger land holdings in Texas and Iowa and Illinois and Nebraska and all those wonderful states out there, it's going to affect them even more. It has a difference. And so one of the most frequent questions that I get asked is, does my voice matter? Because I know many of you are involved in commodity organizations. You may be involved in your state farm bureaus. There are other organizations in which you choose to be active. The answer to that question is an emphatic yes. Because everyone in Washington, D.C. has an opinion. Many of them come from years of study, perhaps in academics, perhaps in the business world or what have you. But oftentimes what makes the difference in a policy discussion is when you can say, this is from personal experience. This is what is actually going to happen if you do this, and the results are either good or bad. Those types of arguments still carry the day in Washington, D.C. I was so glad to hear we have members from Representative James Comer's office as well as Senator Mitch McConnell's office. I've had the pleasure of working with both of those gentlemen directly on issues affecting agriculture. Of course, Senator McConnell sits on the Senate Ag Committee. He's had the pleasure of seeing to it that I was confirmed by the Senate 3 times for 2 different roles at USDA and once as a federal judge. And of course, Chairman Comer serves as chairman of the House Oversight Committee, and he has used that role to advance agriculture policy, and that has not been the typical role of a chairman of that committee, which technically has oversight over the entire federal government. Take it from me, both of those gentlemen are deeply attuned to the needs of agriculture. They very much care about Kentucky farmers, and I'm in a world where there are a whole lot of dilettantes. I remain deeply impressed by how much and how deep into the weeds both of those gentlemen can get. West Kentucky is very lucky to have those people in Washington, D.C. and their experience guiding the policy discussions in both the House and the Senate. My roots here run very deep. As was mentioned in the introduction, the farm that my brother and I own here in Fulton County, Kentucky, actually predates the establishment of this county by the Kentucky State Legislature. When my father passed away in 2015, we were doing some deed work here at the county courthouse in Hickman, and the property value assessor gave us a copy of the original plat of Fulton County when it was laid out by the Kentucky State Legislature following the Jackson Purchase. And on that plat is the farm that my brother and I currently own in exactly its current configuration, with my ancestor John Marshall Alexander's name handwritten across the plat. He gave us a copy of that, and we keep that very proudly, along with some deeds from the early 19th century that are handwritten that we have in our kind of family collection. So the understanding how important the ownership of land is, and understanding how important it is to keep the government the hell off your land and telling you what you can and can't do with it, runs very deep in my blood. No one has to explain those issues to me. What you have worked for your entire life should not be dictated to or taken away from you by someone who will squander the money that comes from it in the blink of an eye. That's why I'm so very glad that as we come into calendar year 2026, we are coming into a calendar year where we have the advantages of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And though that is the name that the President chose to give the piece of legislation, I want you to think about it as what I think it actually is. It's the new Farm Bill. It may not have come through the House and Senate Agriculture Committee. It may have instead come through the reconciliation process, but it's chock full of things for American agriculture. Let's start where I left off with the land. For 99.9% of American citizens, thanks to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the death tax is dead. You're not going to have to pay it. Its amount has been raised to a very high level in terms of where it kicks in, and that amount is going to be indexed to inflation as a matter of permanent law, so that you don't find yourself subject to it through the pernicious influence of inflation through the years. As someone who has had to pay the death tax and had to deal with the Internal Revenue Service after the loss of my father, I know how personally troubling and, quite frankly, from my point of view, immoral it is that some people think the IRS ought to be an uninvited guest at your relative's funeral with their hands stuck out asking for money. And so I'm very grateful that this administration has ended that reality for 99% of all people in this country. Going forward, we're also going to stop playing Russian roulette with your business decisions. Going all the way back to 2015, we have passed a series of acts that provide benefits to you, but they have time limits, which then, of course, forces you to wonder, should I be making a business decision which may have permanent impacts when the benefits may only be temporary, and then bet whether or not the Congress is going to extend those benefits. We've put an end to that with the One Big Beautiful Bill. When you buy a new tractor this year, you'll be able to immediately expense that off your taxes up to $2.5 million. That provision is permanent law. It's not going anywhere. Most farmers, you're pass-through entities. That's the accountant's way of saying you don't pay taxes at the corporate level, you pay them at the individual level. The tax benefits that you get from doing that, they're now permanent law too. They don't have a time clock on them. And most importantly for production agriculture, we have passed an increase in reference prices to our two key commodity support programs, ARC and PLC. For the first time in years, your reference prices will accurately reflect the increased cost of production that you are paying, which means come the 1st of October, when you receive your ARC and PLC payments, they will be based on these new reference prices. The payments will be something they haven't been since before the 2018 Farm Bill, to be perfectly honest. They'll be meaningful to your operation. And for this year, you will not have to guess whether ARC or PLC is right for you. If you're anything like my brother and me, you always make the wrong choice. Whichever one you pick, it's the other one that would have paid more. This year, you're not going to have to worry about that, because we'll do the calculation for every farmer in the United States. We'll do it under both programs, and whichever one would have paid you more, that's what we're sending to your checking account. And that's before we get to the improvements in crop protection insurance and the fact that we now have a stepped-up subsidy, which makes it easier for you to buy the insurance you need to ensure the sustainability of your business on a long-term basis. And all of these changes that I have listed that are in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act are permanent. They're not going anywhere unless some wrong-headed Congress in the future changes them. There's no exploding clock in it anymore. You can plan your businesses knowing that the law isn't going to change on a dime, which is what business needs most of, certainty. Now let me talk a little bit about the state of the ag economy. Obviously, we would wish the ag economy is in a better place. If you go back and you look at the prior 4 years, there are two things that are currently coming home to roost for American agriculture. First, we didn't have a trade policy the prior 4 years. It was the explicit position of the previous administration that they were not going to negotiate any trade deals with anyone. And there were countries who wanted to negotiate, including on agriculture. They would not do so. And then number two, if you go all the way back to 1933, every president except for two can say that they signed a farm bill. Everyone but two. The first is Gerald Ford. He didn't serve a full term, as you know. He only served 2.5 years following Richard Nixon's resignation. But the second is Joe Biden. Joe Biden is the only president to serve a full term since Franklin Delano Roosevelt who didn't sign a farm bill. So that is to say, if you are involved in production agriculture for the last 4 years, you have had no new policy and you have had no new markets open to you. And it really doesn't matter whether I'm talking about farming, whether I'm talking about manufacturing, or whether I'm talking about information technology. If you are involved in any industry and you take a 4-year vacation, you're going to be suffering. And unfortunately, that is what we are seeing now. Because while we were sleeping, the people who compete with all of you in foreign countries were not. They were stealing your market share. Because over the past decade or more, Brazil has been dramatically increasing its agricultural production across the board. Whether you're talking about corn, soy, cotton, sugar, and for the first time ever last calendar year, beef. They now produce more beef in Brazil than we do in the United States. The first time in modern history anyone has outproduced the United States in beef. They have been literally stealing the food off of your table. And they have been doing so by burning down the Amazon rainforest. Literally, burning down the Amazon rainforest to create more cropland and more pasture land to compete with your farms here in West Kentucky and West Tennessee. And you're expected to compete with them in a situation where there were no new trade agreements and you had no new policy being passed through Congress to help your operation. Little wonder the state of the ag economy is where it is. You'll notice I have focused on Brazil, not China. There's a reason for that. China is a customer when it comes to agriculture. We were talking 10 or 15 years ago, it wouldn't matter what our trade policy is. China would have to buy from us. There was no one else who could provide the quantities of commodities that they needed to feed their billion-plus population. Because of the growth of Brazilian agriculture, they now have a choice. And that is reflected in the market price. that new supply that has come on board from Brazil. And here's the other part that people don't want to tell you about China. Their goal, ultimately, is not to buy from either the United States or Brazil. They want to be self-sufficient. That is why the Chinese government is now pumping the equivalent of hundreds of dollars per acre into subsidies to try to convince their own farmers to farm soybeans. And they're working with their Russian counterparts across the border in far eastern Russia to do the same. So we in the United States, when it comes to our ag policy, we have to be focused on two things. Number one, opening as many foreign markets as possible. Because, again, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, whether it's agriculture, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's information technology. If you are dependent on only one or two customers, you're in trouble. They really own you, not the other way around. We cannot have our farmers be dependent on a single or even a group, small group, of single large customers. That puts you in the worst possible situation. And number two, we have to keep in mind that when it comes to American policy, we control what we do here domestically without having to negotiate with anybody overseas. We control our own destiny with regard to that. And we need to pass policies like E15 and like finalizing the EPA's proposed rule on blending biofuels into every gallon of petroleum that you purchase at the gas station, that see to it that when we're talking about liquid fuels, notice my term, liquid fuels. I'm not talking about petroleum only. I'm talking about all liquid fuels. That every gallon of liquid fuel that goes into an American's gas tank is either drilled or grown here in the United States. And if we can do that, then we will have commodity prices that will continue to support the family farm for generations to come, and we will stop having to worry about getting entangled in foreign wars to get the energy we need to run our economy. It is truly a win-win. And if you want to see the change that has happened, even from the president's first term to his second term, when it comes to the focus on the rural economy, I commend to you when you leave here today and perhaps have some cell phone signal, that you can look up an article by the president's top trade advisor, Dr. Peter Navarro. He has an article in a D.C. publication called The Hill. There's no paywall. You can read it. It could have been written by any one of you about biofuels policy. Because the point that Dr. Navarro is making is, if we want to take care of our national security and we want to take care of our economic security, it begins with seeing to it that the Chinese and no other country can have our American farmers over a barrel, and the only way to do that is with an aggressive biofuels policy. Now, I'll tell you, from someone who was in the first term, under Secretary Sonny Perdue at the time at USDA, Dr. Navarro wasn't a great ally when it came to discussions. He was the tariff man and at times saw agriculture as a hindrance to what he wanted to do. But in this second term, and with the much greater outreach that we've done to him and others in the administration, he's now fully on board, and the editorial that he wrote and was published yesterday could have been written by the American Soybean Association. He gets it.
And that concludes part one of a two-part series featuring USDA Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, Stephen Vaden. We hope you enjoyed today's program and invite you to tune in again next week at this same time as we bring you topics and information of importance to our community. From all of us here at Thunderbolt Broadcasting, until we meet again next week, I'm Charles Choate.
You've been listening to 30 Minutes, a community affairs program on Thunderbolt Radio. You can listen to this broadcast and others anytime by visiting thunderboltradio.com and following the Thunderbolt Radio and Digital YouTube page. Thanks for listening.